Jean-Jacques Rousseau began his famous Confessions by a vehement appeal to the deity. I have shown myself as I was, contemptible and vile when I was so, good, generous, sublime when I was so. I have unveiled my interior, such as thou thyself hast seen it, eternal Father. Collect about me the innumerable swarm of my fellows. Let them hear my confessions. Let them groan at my unworthiness. Let them blush at my meanness. Let each of them discover his heart in his turn at the foot of thy throne with the same sincerity. And then let any one of them tell thee, if he dares, I was a better man. Jean-Jacques was a very great educator in the manner of the 18th century, and has been commonly thought to have had more influence than any other teacher of his time. But his peculiar method of improving human nature has not been universally admired. Most educators of the 19th century have declined to show themselves before their scholars as objects more vile or contemptible than necessary. And even the humblest teacher hides, if possible, the faults with which nature has generously embellished us all, as it did Jean-Jacques, thinking, as most religious minds are apt to do, that the Eternal Father himself may not feel unmixed pleasure at our thrusting under his eyes chiefly the least agreeable details of his creation. As an unfortunate result, the 20th century finds few recent guides to avoid or to follow. American literature offers scarcely one working model for high education. The student must go back beyond Jean-Jacques to Benjamin Franklin to find a model even of self-teaching. Except in this abandoned sphere of the dead languages, no one has discussed what part of education has, in his personal experience, turned out to be useful, and what not. This volume attempts to discuss it. As educator, Jean-Jacques was, in one respect, easily first. He erected a monument of warning against the ego. Since his time, and largely thanks to him, the ego has steadily tended to efface itself and, for purposes of model, to become a mannequin on which the toilet of education is to be draped in order to show the fit or misfit of the clothes. The object of study is the garment, not the figure. The tailor adapts the mannequin as well as the clothes to his patron's wants. The tailor's object in this volume is to fit young men in universities or elsewhere to be men of the world, equipped for any emergency. And the garment offered to them is meant to show the faults of the patchwork fitted on their fathers. At the utmost, the active-minded young man should ask of his teacher only mastery of his tools. The young man himself, the subject of education, is a certain form of energy. The object to be gained is economy of his force. The training is partly the clearing away of obstacles, partly the direct application of effort. Once acquired, the tools and models may be thrown away. The mannequin, therefore, has the same value as any other geometrical figure of 3 or more dimensions, which is used for the study of relation. For that purpose, it cannot be spared. It is the only measure of motion, of proportion, of human condition. It must have the air of reality, must be taken for real, must be treated as though it had life. Who knows? Possibly it had. Under the shadow of Boston State House, turning its back on the house of John Hancock, the little passage called Hancock Avenue runs, or ran, from Beacon Street, skirting the State House grounds, to Mount Vernon Street, on the summit of Beacon Hill. And there, in the third house below Mount Vernon Place, February 16, 1838, a child was born, and christened later by his uncle, the minister of the First Church, after the tenets of Boston Unitarianism, as Henry Brooks Adams. Had he been born in Jerusalem under the shadow of the temple and circumcised in the synagogue by his uncle the high priest under the name of Israel Cohen, he would scarcely have been more distinctly branded, and not much more heavily handicapped in the races of the coming century, in running for such stakes as the century was to offer. But, on the other hand, the ordinary traveler who does not enter the field of racing finds advantage in being, so to speak, ticketed through life with the safeguards of an old established traffic. Safeguards are often irksome, but sometimes convenient, and if one needs them all at all, one is apt to need them badly. 100 years earlier, such safeguards as his would have secured any young man's success. And although in 1838 their value was not very great compared with what they would have had in 1738, yet the mere accident of starting a 20th century career from a nest of associations so colonial, so troglodytic, as the First Church, the Boston State House, Beacon Hill, John Hancock, and John Adams, Mount Vernon Street, and Quincy, all crowding on 10 pounds of unconscious babyhood, was so queer as to offer a subject of curious speculation to the baby long after he had witnessed dissolution. What could become of such a child of the 17th and 18th centuries when he should wake up to find himself required to play the game of the 20th? Had he been consulted, would he have cared to play the game at all, holding such cards as he held, and suspecting that the game was to be one of which neither he nor anyone else, back to the beginning of time, knew the rules, or the risk, or the stakes? He was not consulted, and was not responsible. But had he been taken into the confidence of his parents, he would certainly have told them to change nothing as far as concerned him. He would have been astounded by his own luck. Probably no child born in the year held better cards than he. Whether life was an honest game of chance, or whether the cards were marked and forced, he could not refuse to play his excellent hand. He could never make the usual plea of irresponsibility. He accepted the situation as though he had been a party to it, and under the same circumstances would do it again, the more readily for knowing the exact values. To his life as a whole, he was a consenting, contracting party and partner from the moment he was born to the moment he died. Only with that understanding, as a consciously assenting member in full partnership with the society of his age, had his education an interest to himself or to others. As it happened, he never got to the point of playing the game at all. He lost himself in the study of it, watching the errors of the players. But this is the only interest in the story, which otherwise has no moral and little incident, a story of education. 70 years of it. The practical value remains to the end in doubt, like other values about which men have disputed since the birth of Cain and Abel. But the practical value of the universe has never been stated in dollars, although everyone cannot be a Gargantua, Napoleon, Bismarck, and walk off with the great bells of Notre Dame. Everyone must bear his own universe, and most persons are moderately interested in learning how their neighbors have managed to carry theirs. This problem of education started in 1838, went on for 3 years while the baby grew, like other babies, unconsciously, as a vegetable, the outside world working as it never had worked before, to get his new universe ready for him. Often in old age he puzzled over the question whether, on the doctrine of chances, he was at liberty to accept himself or his world as an accident. No such accident had ever happened before in human experience. For him alone, the old universe was thrown into the ash heap and a new one created. He and his 18th century troglodytic Boston were suddenly cut apart, separated forever, in act if not in sentiment, by the opening of the Boston and the Albany Railroad, the appearance of the first Cunard steamers in the bay, and the telegraphic messages which carried from Baltimore to Washington the news that Henry Clay and James K. Polk were nominated for the presidency. This was in May 1844. He was 6 years old. His new world was ready for use, and only fragments of the old met his eyes. Of all this that was being done to complicate his education, he knew only the color of yellow. He first found himself sitting on a yellow kitchen floor in strong sunlight. He was 3 years old when he took this earliest step in education, a lesson of color. The second followed soon, a lesson of taste. On December 3rd, 1841, he developed scarlet fever. For several days, he was as good as dead, reviving only under the careful nursing of his family. When he began to recover strength, January 1st, 1842, his hunger must have been stronger than any other pleasure or pain. For while in afterlife he retained not the faintest recollection of his illness, he remembered quite clearly his aunt entering the sick room bearing in her hand a saucer with a baked apple. The order of impressions retained by memory might naturally be that of color and taste, although one would rather suppose that the sense of pain would be first to educate. In fact, the third recollection of the child was that of discomfort. The moment he could be removed, he was bundled up in blankets and carried from the little house in Hancock Avenue to a larger one which his parents were to occupy for the rest of their lives in the neighboring Mount Vernon Street. The season was midwinter, January 10th, 1842, and he never forgot his acute distress for want of air under his blankets or the noises of moving furniture. As a means of variation from a normal type, sickness in childhood ought to have a certain value, not to be classed under any fitness or unfitness of natural selection, and especially scarlet fever affected boys seriously, both physically and in character, though they might, through life, puzzle themselves to decide whether it had fitted or unfitted them for success. But this fever of Henry Adams took greater and greater importance in his eyes, from the point of view of education, the longer he lived. At first, the effect was physical. He fell behind his brothers 2 or 3 inches in height, and proportionally in bone and weight. His character and processes of mind seemed to share in this fining down process of scale. He was not good in a fight, and his nerves were more delicate than boys' nerves ought to be. He exaggerated these weaknesses as he grew older. The habit of doubt, of distrusting his own judgment, and of totally rejecting the judgment of the world, the tendency to regard every question as open, the hesitation to act except as a choice of evils, the shirking of responsibility, the love of line, form, quality, the horror of ennui, the passion for companionship, and the antipathy to society. All these are well-known qualities of New England character, in no way particular to individuals, but in this instance they seem to be stimulated by the fever. And Henry Adams could never make up his mind whether, on the whole, the change of character was morbid or healthy, good or bad for his purpose. His brothers were the type, he was the variation. As far as the boy knew, the sickness did not affect him at all, and he grew up in excellent health, bodily and mental, taking life as it was given, accepting its local standards without a difficulty, and enjoying much of it as keenly as any other boy of his age. He seemed to himself quite normal, and his companions seemed always to think him so. Whatever was particular about him was education, not character, and came to him directly and indirectly as the result of that 18th century inheritance which he took with his name. The atmosphere of education in which he lived was colonial, revolutionary, almost Cromwellian, and though he were steeped from his greatest-grandmother's birth in the odor of political crime, resistance to something was the law of New England, nature. The boy looked out on the world with the instinct of resistance. For numberless generations, his predecessors had viewed the world chiefly as a thing to be reformed, filled with evil forces to be abolished, and they saw no reason to suppose that they had wholly succeeded in the abolition. The duty was unchanged. That duty implied not only resistance to evil, but hatred of it. Boys naturally look on all force as an enemy, and generally find it so, but the New Englander, whether boy or man, in his long struggle with a stingy or hostile universe, had learned also to love the pleasure of hating. His joys were few. Politics, as a practice, whatever its professions, had always been the systematic organization of hatreds, and Massachusetts politics had been as harsh as the climate. The chief charm of New England was harshness, of contrasts, and extremes of sensibility. a cold that froze the blood and a heat that boiled it, so that the pleasure of hating one's self, if no better victim offered, was not its rarest amusement. But the charm was a true and natural child of the soil, not a cultivated weed of the ancients. The violence of the contrast was real and made the strongest motive of education. The double exterior nature gave life its relative values. Winter and summer, cold and heat, town and country, force and freedom, marked two modes of life and thought, balanced like lobes of the brain. Town was winter, confinement, school, ruled, disciplined, straight, gloomy streets, piled with 6 feet of snow in the middle, frost that made the snow sing under wheels or runners, thaws when the streets became dangerous to cross, society of uncles, aunts, and cousins who expected children to behave themselves and who were not always gratified. Above all else, winter represented the desire to escape and go free. Town was restraint, law, unity. Country, only 7 miles away, was liberty, diversity, outlawry, the endless delight of mere sense impressions given by nature for nothing and breathed by boys without knowing it. Boys are wild animals, rich in the treasures of sense, but the New England boy had a wider range of emotions than boys of more equable climates. He felt his nature crudely, as it was meant. To the boy Henry Adams, summer was drunken. Among senses was the strongest, smell of hot pine woods and sweet fern in the scorching summer noon, of new-mown hay, of plowed earth, of box hedges, of peaches, lilacs, syringas, of stables, barns, cowyards, of salt, water, and low tide on the marshes. Nothing came amiss. Next to smell came taste, and the children knew the taste of everything they saw or touched, from pennyroyal and flagroot to the shell of a pignut and the letters of a spelling book. The taste of A, B, AB, suddenly revived on the boy's tongue 60 years afterwards. Light, line, and color, as sensual pleasures, came later and were as crude as the rest. The New England light is glare, and the atmosphere harshens. The New England light is glare, and the atmosphere harshens color. The boy was a full man before he ever knew what was meant by atmosphere. His idea of pleasure in light was the blaze of a New England sun. His idea of color was a peony, with the dew of early morning on its petals, the intense blue of the sea as he saw it a mile or two away from the Quincy Hills, the cumuli in a June afternoon sky, the strong reds and greens and purples of colored prints in children's picture books, as the American colors then ran. These were ideals. The opposites or antipathies were the cold grays of November evenings and the thick, muddy thaws of Boston winter. With such standards, the Bostonian could not but develop a double nature. Life was a double thing. After a January blizzard, the boy who could look with pleasure into the violent snow glare of the cold, white sunshine with its intense light and shade scarcely knew what was meant by tone. He could reach it only by education. Winter and summer, then, were two hostile lives and bred two separate natures. Winter was always the effort to live. Summer was tropical license. Whether the children rolled in the grass or waded in the brook or swam in the salt ocean or sailed in the bay or fished for smelts in the creeks or netted minnows in the salt marshes or took to the pine woods and the granite quarries or chased muskrats and hunted snapping turtles in the swamps or mushrooms or nuts on the autumn hills, summer and country were always sensual living, while winter was always compulsory learning. Summer was the multiplicity of nature. Winter was school. The bearing of the two seasons on the education of Henry Adams was no fancy. It was the most decisive force he ever knew. It ran through life, and made the division between its perplexing, warring, irreconcilable problems, irreducible opposites, with growing emphasis to the last year of study. From earliest childhood, the boy was accustomed to feel that, for him, life was double. Winter and summer, town and country, law and liberty were hostile, and the man who pretended they were not was, in his eyes, a schoolmaster, that is, a man employed to tell lies to little boys. though Quincy was but 2 hours' walk from Beacon Hill. It belonged in a different world. For 200 years, every Adams, from father to son, had lived within sight of State Street, and sometimes had lived in it, yet none had ever taken kindly to the town, or been taken kindly by it. The boy inherited his double nature. He knew as yet nothing about his great-grandfather, who had died a dozen years before his own birth. He took for granted that any great-grandfather of his must have always been good, and his enemies wicked, but he divined his great-grandfather's character from his own. Never for a moment did he connect the two ideas of Boston and John Adams. They were separate and antagonistic. The idea of John Adams went with Quincy. He knew his grandfather, John Quincy Adams, only as an old man of 75 or 80 who was friendly and gentle with him. But except that he heard his grandfather always called the President and his grandmother the Madam, he had no reason to suppose that his Adams grandfather differed in character from his Brooks grandfather, who was equally kind and benevolent. He liked the Adams side best, but for no other reason than that it reminded him of the country, the summer, and the absence of restraint. Yet he felt also that Quincy was in a way inferior to Boston, and that socially Boston looked down on Quincy. The reason was clear enough even to a 5-year-old child. Quincy had no Boston style. Little enough style had either. A simpler manner of life and thought could hardly exist short of cave dwelling. The flint and steel with which his grandfather Adams used to light his own fires in the early morning was still on the mantelpiece of his study. The idea of a livery or even a dress for servants or of an evening toilette was next to blasphemy. Bathrooms, water supplies, lighting, heating, and the whole array of domestic comforts were unknown at Quincy. Boston had already a bathroom, a water supply, a furnace, and gas. The superiority of Boston was evident, but a child liked it no better for that. The magnificence of his grandfather Brooks's house in Pearl Street or South Street has long ago disappeared, but perhaps his country house at Medford may still remain to show what impressed the mind of a boy in 1845 with the idea of city splendor. The President's place at Quincy was the larger and older and by far the more interesting of the two. But a boy felt at once its inferiority in fashion. It showed plainly enough its want of wealth. It smacked of colonial age, but not of Boston style or plush curtains. To the end of his life, he never quite overcame the prejudice thus drawn in with his childish breath. He never could compel himself to care for 19th century style. He was never able to adopt it any more than his father or grandfather or great-grandfather had done. Not that he felt it as particularly hostile, for he reconciled himself to much that was worse, but because for some remote reason he was born an 18th century child. The old house at Quincy was 18th century. What style it had was in its Queen Anne mahogany panels and its Louis-size chairs and sofas. The panels belonged to an old colonial vassal who built the house. The furniture had been brought back from Paris in 1789 or 1801 or 1817, along with porcelain and books and much else of old diplomatic remnants. And neither of the two 18th century styles, neither English Queen Anne nor French Louis XVI, was comfortable for a boy, or for anyone else. The dark mahogany had been painted white to suit daily life in winter gloom. Nothing seemed to favor for a child's objects the older forms. On the contrary, most boys as well as grown-up people preferred the new, with good reason, and the child felt himself distinctly at a disadvantage for the taste. Nor had personal preference any share in his bias. The Brooks grandfather was as amiable and as sympathetic as the Adams grandfather. Both were born in 1767, and both died in 1848. Both were kind children, and both belonged rather to the 18th than to the 19th centuries. The child knew no difference between them, except that one was associated with winter and the other with summer, one with Boston, the other with Quincy. Even with Medford, the association was hardly easier. Once, as a very young boy, he was taken to pass a few days with his grandfather Brooks under charge of his aunt, but became so violently homesick that within 24 hours he was brought back in disgrace. Yet he could not remember ever being seriously homesick again. Ay, Diosito. ¿Qué pasó? Mi voz. I don't know. I tengo voz.